even somebody, an analyst and commentator in one German review, that German review well known in Greece because of his anti-Greek racism, Forbes, you know, who had this vulgar cover. Even he wrote, but he said that he wants to follow the Greek economic model. What the hell wish to do that, to follow the Greek model? But this is a warning. It's a warning for the Ukrainian people, but also a warning for all the peoples of the European continent and beyond. Because the so-called Greek model, the Greek model of social devastation, the Greek model of social ruin, is a model where a proud it's a model which made this country the country which has the highest rate of unemployment, even higher than the United States during the Great Depression in the 30s. It is a success story, as the Prime Minister Samaras called it, or now Yatsenyuk wants to call it, to follow. A success story that reduced the country to a protectorate of the European Union and the IMF, and reduced a proud people into a nation of destitute, with a very high number of suicides every day, out of social despair. And the only thing until now I think that Ukraine has more than us in Greece is the Ukrainian model. In Ukraine there is the highest rate of AIDS, and higher than in Botswana, in Africa. So, as a doctor I have also the figures. It's terrible. So in this country, which is a model for Yatsenyuk and his masters, we have 67% of the youth without a job and without the hope of a job. We'll discuss it tomorrow too, when the discussion on Greece will come. This success story and this model for Ukraine represent the misery of people where a third of the population is under the line of poverty. We have a new generation without shelters. Only in Athens more than 25,000 ex-petty bourgeois or middle classes who lost their homes, and they sleep in the streets under the rain and under the hunting by the police. The success story of Greece that will be followed in Ukraine means the misery of a people without social and trade union rights. The last, this weekend that we have this conference in the Greek Parliament will be voted a kind of a new agreement, a new law imposed to us by the Troika, which abolish the last remnants of trade union rights that we got. They officialized the lockout by the bosses. You cannot have a trade union decision for a strike. You need to have, I think, more than 50% of those inscribed present in an assembly to have a legal strike. And during these 2 days it will be voted in Parliament. But the Parliament isn't just a rubber stamp. This is bourgeois parliamentary system. For decisions already taken in Brussels, in the banks, or in Washington, D.C. by this Quisling government that you have. By the way, also in Kiev, it's a Quisling government, more openly, because we were not voted by nobody, only by private sector in Svoboda, by killing people. So this success story is secured by the brutality of security forces, of the security state forces, assisted by fascist gangs, and by establishing in these days of a new Guantanamo-like prisons of the C-type, Gamma type, where they introduce a system of prisons within the prisons, plus new, we don't have money for schools. They close down one hospital after another. They dismiss thousands of teachers, professors, and doctors, and nurses, etc. And they establish a new Alcatraz, something like that, in Domokos, with a high security, where really, particularly the political prisoners, could not have any right, absolutely no right. And very rarely their family could meet them. They could not call on the phone, etc. It's barbarism. It's Guantanamo in Europe. Okay? Much worse than the Amygdaleza concentration camps and other camps where they packed thousands of Pakistanis and other immigrants. This is the economic model of Ukraine. Okay? This comrade Yuri can transmit there. Greece and Ukraine represent the only present and the future that the European Union in crisis promises to all European peoples. East and West, North and South. The call to this conference rightly has stressed, and I quote, "The ongoing world capitalist crisis is the basis and the driving force of the barbarism that threaten us. Various success stories claimed by the rulers in Ireland, or Greece, or Spain, or Portugal, thanks to austerity, that is social cannibalism, imposed by the hated Troika of the European Union, European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, demonstrate only the cynicism of the ruling class and of their governments. Prospects for a jobless recovery, a contradiction in terms, cannot fool nobody, but only those who want to be fooled. And the mass media, they do their job. Mass unemployment has become the endless nightmare for the vast majority of the population. By the way, the absolute majority of the members of my party are jobless youth. The absolute majority, 66% in the last National Congress. It is the national average anyway. That means we are rooted in the Greek working class very well, in one sense. So, in the same time, all social services, particularly in health and education, are collapsing in ruins. We don't have intensive care units. People die from heart attacks, strokes, cancer, without any help. Migrant communities face racist discrimination and continuous attacks by the European Union and state authorities, which are assisted by the growing far-right parties and Nazi gangs. The European Union has transformed Europe into a fortress Europe, and the Mediterranean into a graveyard for immigrants. As the non-stop tragedies in Lampedusa in Italy and Pharmakonisi in Greece demonstrate. Women oppression escalates. An example is the anti-abortion legislation introduced in Spain in the spirit of the Holy Inquisition. but which face also very important opposition. And discrimination against sexual orientation, homophobia, etc., social exclusion and oppression of all minorities transform European civilization into barbarism, or barbarism within the current civilization. The world crisis has its center in the United States, started with the collapse of the subprime mortgage market, you know that, and rapidly moved its epicenter in Europe, particularly after the Lehman Brothers debacle. In our call to this conference, we point out, for 7 years now, the unprecedented global crisis, superseding even the Great Depression of the 30s, has engulfed the capitalist world. Europe has become the epicenter of that crisis, plunging in a vicious circle of over-indebtedness and recession, exasperated now by what Christine Lagarde, head of the IMF, has called the ogre of the dragon, the ogre of deflation. Now, new developments in the crisis, particularly the tapering of the quantitative easing by the Fed in the United States, the slowing of the Chinese economy, affected deeply the so-called BRICS, renamed now as the Fragile Five, or Fragile Eight, or Fragile 10, or Fragile whatever. And that will and is exacerbating the unresolved crisis in Europe itself. Tomorrow we have the special session which will discuss also the crisis, starting also, as I said before, by the talk by Hillel. And we can discuss more. We will have the opportunity to discuss more about what historical basis, the specific structural nature of the current crisis. Now I want to move to another point, that long ago the economic crisis has been transformed into a political regime crisis of various forms in each country. But it's easy to recognize now the decay of the parliamentary system that is reduced to rubber stamping the decisions of the Troika. Popular anger is concentrated against all the parties that have shared so far governmental power, putting blame and disrepute to them, producing an unprecedented regime crisis as the management of the crisis itself becomes more and more impossible. It's not just that you have a crisis, they cannot manage the crisis. They return to the same measures and exacerbating the crisis. Every measure they take in Brussels, Washington, everywhere, well, it turns to a boomerang. And after a certain period, then return and becomes worse, the situation. Meantime, between then the one moment and the other, the crisis disappears from the front pages of the press, and everybody say, okay, we have success story, this crisis has finished. But then come back in different forms. This crisis of all forms of government does not include only the parliamentary elected governments, but also the so-called technocratic governments like Monti's in Italy or the Papadimos in Greece. These two kinds of governments as well failed completely under the pressure of the popular anger as well. No? That works? Okay,
Comrades, this meeting, of course, along with all the other aspects, costs a lot of money. So there will be a money collection round now. Would people contribute to the best of their capacities, from each according to their capacity, to this the financial costs of this meeting? We will go on now, but there will be collection.
So, I try to accelerate. Okay. We have a crisis of legitimacy of every government now in Europe. We have also social polarization. And from one side you can see signs of left-wing turn for the masses, expressed in different ways, both in mobilizations or in electoral results, like in Greece, for example, in 2012. But also you can see the rise of the far right and the fascism. Europe had become the continent of the greatest contrasts. In the past 10 years ago, in 2004, in Buenos Aires, when we had the founding congress of our international organization, the coordinating committee for the refoundation of the Fourth International, I remember that in the program that we voted there, we spoke about the prospect of Latino-Americanization of Europe. We have not only we have something worse than Latino-Americanization of Europe now. But let's look at this, of the most important of this greatest contrast of the last days, as it were manifested, the last weeks, or 2 days, or 2 weeks. On March 22, in Madrid, you had 2 million people assembled after the fantastic March for Dignity and clashing with the riot police. And these 2 million people of the March for Dignity, they had their central slogan in the front of the march. It was, we don't pay the debt, cancellation of the debt, down with all the governments of Troika. From the other side, the next day, on March 23, the far-right Front National of Marine Le Pen in France got a spectacular electoral victory in the first round of the local and municipal elections in that country, imposing an humiliating defeat to the hated by the people, social democratic, social liberal Hollande, François Hollande government regime, and its satellites in the left, including the PSF, the Communist Party of France, who decided to have a common list of the Social Democrats in Paris. So from the other side, to give another contrast, on February 5, 2014, a totally unexpected proletarian uprising by the Tuzla workers in Bosnia led to a popular rebellion all over this small fragment of the former Yugoslavia. And it's important that both in Sarajevo, in Mostar, even in Banja Luka, of course in Tuzla, in other places, the demonstrators wrote in the walls, "Death to nationalism, death to imperialism." They burned the houses, the offices, the headquarters of all the nationalist, even fascist parties. I mean, like the Ustashi party was burned down. And as well, they demanded also the abolition of the Dayton Accords, imposed by imperialism, as you know. The police in this protectorate, which has only 3.5 million inhabitants and has 13 governments, it's really pulverized in cantons, 13 governments, you can imagine. But the real government is the High Commissioner of the European Union, who, by the way, is an Austrian, who thinks he lives in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Because he said that he threatened everybody that he will call European Union troops to crush the demonstrations, the army. And by the way, it's strange. I mean, what happens in Bosnia is characterized by the mass media everywhere to be vandalism. what happens in Ukraine is revolution.